Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlet Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. The sound that woke me was not loud. It was the kind of sound that slips into your dream and waits there, patient until you notice it. A slow scrape, like something heavy being turned with care. I was working nights then, the kind of job people forget exists. I watched over a small public greenhouse on the edge of a coastal town in Nova Scotia. The sort of place that stayed open year-round, because the town liked knowing something green survived the winter. Snow pressed against the glass walls for months at a time, trapping the warmth inside like a held breath. That winter felt longer than the others. Snow didn't fall so much as arrive and refuse to leave. The sky stayed pale even at night, and the ocean beyond the trees was frozen into a dull, unmoving sheet. I took the night shift because I didn't sleep well around people anymore. After my brother moved out, the house felt too big and too quiet, and I carried a habit of pacing when I should have been resting. Walking the greenhouse aisles gave that habit somewhere to go. The heaters hummed softly, steady and dull. Moist air fogged the glass, and every leaf held a shine like it was listening. Most nights passed without memory. That one did not. The scrape came again, slower this time. It seemed to come from above me, near the curved roof where metal ribs met glass. I stood still, waiting for it to turn into something I could explain. At the time, it felt normal to listen. Buildings made sounds when winter squeezed them. I told myself that and kept walking. I had another habit back then, one I didn't like admitting. When the silence pressed too hard, I talked. Not full sentences, just small comments, a way to feel present. Settle down, I said quietly, not aiming it at anything. The words fogged the air and faded. Something answered, not with sound at first, but with pressure. The glass above me bowed inward, just enough to notice, then eased back. I stopped walking. The greenhouse was old. Thick panes, reinforced joints built to handle snow load. I knew its limits. What I felt didn't match them. I stood under the tallest section, neck aching as I looked up. The roof was empty. Snow lay smooth and untouched. A drop of water slid down the inside of the glass and landed on my sleeve. Warm. The heaters were working too well. I finished my round faster than usual and stayed near the desk by the entrance. I didn't turn the radio on. Sound felt like a mistake. Around 1, the scrape returned. Closer now. It moved along the roof line in a straight path. Careful, almost respectful. I had the thought then that something was counting. I didn't know why. The idea came fully formed and sat in my chest. I told myself to stop feeding it. Imagination grows when you give it attention. I stood and walked beneath the sound, matching its pace without meaning to. The scrape slowed, so did I. The glass flexed again. A long, gentle press, as if a palm were laid flat above me. My breath caught, sharp and sudden. I thought of my brother, the way he used to sneak up behind me when we were kids. How he loved that first startled gasp. I used to tell him to stop. He never did. "I'm working," I said, softer than before. The words felt like a rule I was trying to remember. The pressure lifted. The rest of the night passed without incident, but sleep didn't come when my shift ended. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that slow, patient wait again. I came back the next night because that's what I did then. I showed up even when something in me suggested staying away. Snow had sealed the paths, and the town felt even farther than usual. The greenhouse smelled sweeter that night. Too sweet. Like sap warming too fast. I did my rounds carefully, eyes on the roof. Nothing moved. Near the far corner where the citrus trees grew under artificial light, I noticed the soil had been disturbed. Not dug, pressed. I crouched and touched it. The earth was warm, shaped in a long, shallow curve, as if something had rested there and moved on. I straightened slowly. That's when I realized the heaters were off. The air was still warm, but the hum was gone. No mechanical noise, no explanation. I walked toward the control panel, steps measured. Halfway there, the scrape returned, this time inside the walls, not above, around. It circled the greenhouse in a slow loop, brushing against metal supports, never striking, never rushing. I felt followed without being chased. I stopped speaking after that. I stood very still and let the sound pass me again and again, like tide against shore. At some point, I became aware of another smell beneath the plants and damp soil. Dry wood, old dust. It reminded me of the attic in my childhood home, the place my brother and I were never supposed to go. We went anyway. He always went first. The scrape stopped behind me. I did not turn. I watched the reflection in the glass ahead of me, my own shape pale and small among leaves. Something else moved behind me, not clear enough to describe, only enough to notice. The glass did not shatter, it flexed. A long line appeared across it, not a crack, but a stretch, as if the surface were being tested for give. Slow, patient. My hands curled into fists without my permission. I felt the old urge rise, the one I'd carried since childhood. The urge to respond, to acknowledge. I remembered nights when my brother would tap the wall between our rooms, waiting until I tapped back. I hated how much control that gave him. The line in the glass deepened. I lifted my hand. It hovered inches from the surface, trembling. I told myself I was checking for damage. That explanation felt thin. The pressure on the glass eased, just slightly, as if something were waiting. I stood there, hand raised, heart loud in my ears, aware of every small choice that led me to that moment. Outside, snow pressed in. Inside, the plants held their breath. My knuckles drifted closer, almost touching. My hand stopped before it touched. Not because I chose to stop, but because my arm felt tired in a way that did not belong to muscle. The air around me held still, as if it were waiting for the smallest signal. I let my hand fall back to my side. The glass eased, not snapping away, just returning to its shape like it had never been pressed at all. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then the lights dimmed. Not off, just lower, softer, as if the greenhouse were settling into evening even though night had already claimed it. The plants shifted in the quiet, leaves brushing leaves. I stepped back without turning. My shoes dragged against the floor, loud in my own ears. I expected the scrape to follow. It did not. Instead, the warmth faded. Slowly, gently, like a promise being taken back. The smell of damp soil gave way to something thinner, drier. I stayed where I was until the clock on the wall clicked to the next minute. That sound felt important, like proof that time was still moving the way it should. I focused on it until my breath found a steady pace again. I finished the shift without walking beneath the tallest glass. I kept to the edges, close to doors and switches. When morning came, the greenhouse looked harmless, bright with pale winter sun. I told myself I'd imagined the worst of it. That exhaustion had shaped shadows and filled them with memory. I went home and slept for 12 hours. When I woke, my hands still smelled like warm earth. I didn't quit. I wish I could say I did. I needed the money, and I needed to know if the place would feel different with daylight behind me. The next night, the snow fell heavier. Wind pressed against the structure in long, even waves. The greenhouse lights glowed like a lantern left out on purpose. I entered with my shoulders already tight. The air inside was balanced, not too warm, not too cold. The heaters hummed again as if nothing had ever interrupted them. I walked the aisles slowly. The disturbed soil near the citrus trees had been smoothed. I told myself someone must have come in during the day. Still, I didn't kneel there again. Around midnight, I noticed the condensation on the glass had changed. Not thicker, Long streaks ran downward in places where there should have been none, as if warmth were being drawn in careful paths. I followed them with my eyes, feeling watched without knowing from where. That's when I realized something else. The scrape had never sounded rushed. It had never searched. It had always known where I was. I leaned against the desk and closed my eyes for a moment. In the dark behind them, I saw my brother's grin, the way he would wait just long enough before doing something that made you jump. He liked that pause, the control of it. I opened my eyes and kept them open. The first new sound of the night came from below. A soft shift underfoot, like soil settling where it shouldn't. I froze, listening. It moved again, slow and wide, as if something were adjusting its weight beneath the floor. Not digging, resting. I thought about the way the greenhouse had been built, about shallow foundations and warmth meant to reach down into the ground. I didn't like how easily that thought connected to the pressure I'd felt above me. I backed away from the sound and stood near the entrance. My keys felt heavy in my pocket. Leaving crossed my mind and stayed there. The sound beneath the floor faded. In its place came something softer, closer to breath than movement. It rose through the space, filling it without traveling. I found myself speaking again before I meant to. "Not tonight," I said, barely louder than thought. It felt like setting a boundary I wasn't sure I had the right to make. The breath paused. The lights dimmed another fraction, then held. Minutes passed, then more. Nothing touched the glass or the floor. I stayed until the end of the shift because leaving felt like answering a question I didn't want to be asked. When daylight returned, I noticed fine lines in the condensation that looked almost like fingerprints, stretched and faded. They were gone by the time the sun climbed higher. I took a day off after that. I walked the town, listened to the ocean groan under ice, reminded myself that the world extended beyond glass walls. The quiet followed me anyway. When I returned from my next shift, the greenhouse felt smaller. Not physically. The space between things had tightened. I didn't hear the scrape at first. What I noticed was the way the plants leaned, not toward light, but inward, as if sharing something. I stayed near the center aisle. I didn't look up. The pressure came without warning, not above or below. Beside me, the glass wall bowed inward, slow and deep, stopping just short of sound. I felt it through the floor, through my teeth. It wasn't testing anymore. I lifted my hand again, not toward the glass this time, but toward my chest. I pressed my palm there and breathed through the tightness. I thought about all the times I'd answered when I should have stayed quiet. "I'm not doing this," I said. The words felt steadier than I expected. The pressure held. Long enough for doubt to bloom. Then it shifted away, not retreating, just relocating, like weight changing sides on a bed. The glass relaxed. I didn't feel relief. I felt noticed. The rest of the night passed without sound. That scared me more than the scrape ever had. I put in my notice the next morning. I didn't give a reason. No one asked. On my last night, I walked the greenhouse one final time. I kept my hands in my pockets. I didn't speak. Near the citrus trees, the soil had been pressed again, deeper now, shaped like something had settled in and decided to stay. I stood there until the heaters clicked off for morning. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't touch the glass. As I left, I felt that familiar urge rise, sharp and insistent. The urge to acknowledge, to respond. I paused at the door, hand on the frame, listening to the quiet stretch behind me. The air held, patient as ever. I stepped outside instead, letting the cold take the space my words would have filled. Behind me, the greenhouse lights dimmed once more, just enough to notice. Story number 2. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the building sounded when the leaves stopped moving. Not silent, just empty. Like a held breath. I was working nights as a security guard at a closed community college in western Massachusetts. The campus had shut down a year earlier, and my job was to make sure nothing broke and nothing wandered in. Most nights, the hardest part was staying awake. It was late October, the kind of autumn where everything feels tired instead of bright. Wet leaves stuck to the sidewalks, and the air smelled like cold paper and old rain. I took the job because I needed routine. After a mistake I don't like talking about, structure felt safer than people. Walking the same paths, checking the same doors, counting the same steps, gave my thoughts something to lean on. The campus was small. 3 buildings, all brick, all dark by 10. I parked near the library and started my rounds the same way every night. At the time, it felt normal. The library was the oldest building on campus. It had tall windows and long hallways that echoed even when you walked slow. The lights inside stayed dim, half power to save money. I unlocked the side door, stepped in, and locked it behind me. The smell inside was always the same: dust, carpet cleaner, and something flat I couldn't name. I walked past the circulation desk and down the main aisle. My footsteps came back to me softer than they should have. The shelves were mostly empty now, but my body still moved like they were full. I had a bad habit I was trying to quit. When I got nervous, I counted things: steps, lights, door hinges, anything solid. I counted 12 lights down the main hall, all on. In the reading room, the windows were streaked with rain. Outside, the trees pressed close, bare and tangled. Their shadows stayed still when the wind dropped. I stood there longer than usual. Something about the room felt different, like it had shifted when I wasn't looking. I checked my watch and told myself to move on. That was when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure. The room felt fuller, like someone had just stepped in behind me. I turned. No one was there. I didn't think much of it. Old buildings do that. They settle. They breathe. I finished the library and moved on to the admin building. That one always felt lighter. More glass, less history. By the time I reached the science hall, the rain had stopped. The leaves outside lay flat and shiny, like they were listening. Science hall was my least favorite. Long corridors, low ceilings, no windows. Even during the day, it felt like night lived there. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The lights came on with a delay, buzzing before settling. The air was cooler than the other buildings. I walked slow, letting my eyes adjust. The hallway stretched straight ahead, doors on either side, labs, offices, storage rooms. Halfway down, I felt it again. That same sense of presence, closer this time. Not behind me, around me. I stopped walking. The feeling didn't go away. It stayed steady, patient, like it was waiting for me to notice it properly. I cleared my throat. The sound felt too loud. "Just checking," I said, mostly to hear my own voice. The words didn't echo. That bothered me more than the feeling. I moved again, slower. The floor tiles were clean, but my boots made a faint dragging sound, like something was brushing them back. I reached the end of the hall, where the old lecture room sat unused. The door was closed, as it always was. I checked the handle. Locked. I wrote it down on my clipboard, even though I knew it would be. Routine mattered. As I turned to leave, I noticed something small. The air near the door felt thicker. Not warm or cold, just dense. I lifted my hand and waved it through the space. It felt like pushing through water for a second. Then nothing. I pulled my hand back and flexed my fingers. They felt fine. I laughed under my breath, quick and quiet. Nerves, that's all. I finished the building without anything else happening. When I got back to my car to sit and warm up, I realized my shoulders hurt from being held too tight. The next night, the leaves were gone, swept into piles by the wind. The campus looked cleaner, sharper. I started my rounds the same way. Library first. Inside, the air felt unchanged. Still, heavy, familiar. I walked through without stopping. In the reading room, one of the lights flickered. It had never done that before. I wrote it down and moved on. Science hall waited in the dark. The door stuck a little when I unlocked it, like it had been held. Inside, the lights took longer to come on. The hallway felt narrower. I told myself I was tired, that counting might help. I counted doors this time. Left, right, left, right. I made it to the lecture room again and paused. The dense air was still there, pressed close to the door. I didn't touch it. Instead, I leaned in and listened. not to the room, to myself. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. Not panic. Recognition. I thought about the mistake that put me here, the way I had ignored a small warning because it felt easier not to see it. I swallowed and stepped back. On my way out, I noticed something else. The dragging sound near my boots was clearer now, not pulling, following. I finished the shift without incident, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that thick air again. By the fourth night, I stopped counting. The habit had turned against me. Every number felt like an invitation. The campus was quiet in a way that felt practiced. Even the wind stayed away. In the library, I caught my reflection in the glass. For a moment, it looked like someone was standing too close behind me. When I turned, there was nothing. In Science Hall, the lecture room door looked different. Not open, just closer. The dense air had spread, creeping along the wall, pooling at the corners. I stood at the end of the hallway and watched it without moving. A thought came to me then, soft and unwelcome, that the room wasn't empty. It was full of something that didn't need light. I took a step forward. The air shifted in response. Not away. Toward me. My radio crackled at my hip, sudden and sharp. I jumped and cursed quietly, then froze. The crackle stopped. I stood there, hand hovering near the lecture room door, aware of how late it had gotten, aware of how easy it would be to walk away, aware of how hard it felt not to. I didn't touch the handle yet. I listened to the quiet stretch around me and felt the building weight. I stood there longer than I meant to. The quiet felt stretched thin, like it would tear if I moved too fast. My hand stayed close to the handle without touching it. The air shifted again, not stronger, closer. I took one slow breath and stepped back. The feeling followed, adjusting the way a shadow does when you move a lamp. It didn't rush. It didn't resist. I told myself I didn't have to solve anything, that this was just another building, another night. The words felt small, but I let them sit anyway. I turned away from the lecture room and walked down the hall. The dragging sound stayed with me, just behind my steps. Not loud enough to hear clearly, loud enough to feel. At the end of the hall, I stopped. The feeling didn't stop with me. It settled. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a second. My radio was quiet. My breathing wasn't. I thought about leaving early. The idea came easy and stayed close, but another thought followed it, heavier and slower. That if I left now, I would carry this place with me anyway. I opened my eyes and stood up straight. The hallway looked the same. The lights hummed softly, steady and tired. I finished the rest of the building without going back to the lecture room. The feeling stayed present, but it didn't press. It felt satisfied to be noticed. When the shift ended, dawn was already pushing at the sky. I locked the doors and sat in my car longer than usual, hands resting on the wheel. The campus looked harmless in the gray light. I slept poorly that day. Dreams came in pieces, hallways without doors, rooms that felt full even when they were empty. I came back the next night because routine is a hard thing to break, because I needed to know if the feeling would return, because part of me already knew it would. The campus was colder. The wind moved low and steady, never lifting. Leaves scraped across the pavement in slow circles. Inside the library, everything felt unchanged. The heavy air hadn't followed me there. That almost made it worse. Science Hall waited. The door opened easily this time. The lights flickered once, then stayed on. I stood just inside and listened. Nothing moved. I walked the hallway without counting. My body wanted to start, but I didn't let it. The urge passed, leaving a hollow behind. The lecture room door was still closed. The dense air rested against it like it had never left. I stopped several feet away. "I'm just here to check," I said quietly. The words felt careful, chosen. The air shifted. Not away, not closer. It changed shape. I realized then that it wasn't guarding the room. It was using it. The thought came without panic. It settled like something I'd known before and forgotten. I stayed where I was. I didn't reach for the handle. The air pressed lightly against my chest, then eased. Minutes passed. The feeling thinned, stretched, and finally slid back toward the door. I watched it gather there, patient as ever. When I turned to leave, it didn't follow. That night passed without more trouble. So did the next. The feeling didn't disappear. It learned. Sometimes it waited near the lecture room. Sometimes it lingered by the ceiling. Once, it rested low along the floor, cool and quiet. It never blocked my path. It never touched me. It stayed close enough to remind me it was there. I started to understand its timing. It appeared when the campus was still, when nothing else moved or made noise. It liked gaps, spaces between sounds, moments without purpose. I adjusted. I kept the radio on low. I walked with intention, even when there was nowhere to go. The feeling responded by shrinking. It didn't leave. It waited. Near the end of the week, I found myself standing outside the lecture room again. I hadn't planned to stop. My feet just slowed. The door looked the same. Old wood, scratched handle, nothing special. The air around it felt calm, too calm. I rested my hand against the wall beside the door. Not the handle, just the wall. It felt solid, normal. I let my hand stay there longer than necessary. The feeling stirred, curious but cautious. It didn't press this time. "I know," I said, not sure what I meant. The words came out softer than a whisper. The air shifted once, like a breath being taken and released. Then it pulled back, deeper into the room. I stepped away. That was the first night I didn't feel followed when I left. The campus seemed lighter, like something had moved deeper inside rather than clinging to the surface. I slept better after that. Not well, but better. On my last scheduled night, a storm rolled in. Rain hit the buildings in a steady rhythm. The campus smelled clean, washed. Inside Science Hall, the lights stayed steady. The hallway felt wider. I walked it slowly, listening to the rain work its way down the walls. The lecture room door waited at the end, quiet. I stopped a few feet away and stood there, letting the moment stretch. The air around me stayed neutral, no pressure, no pull. I thought about the mistake that had brought me here, how I had ignored something small until it became unavoidable, how easy it is to confuse silence with safety. I didn't open the door. I didn't touch it. "I won't," I said, more to myself than anything else. The words felt like a boundary. The air changed one last time, not retreating, settling. I finished the shift without another incident. When dawn came, the campus looked empty and ordinary. I turned in my badge that morning. I didn't give a reason. No one asked. Sometimes when I pass old buildings at night, I feel that same thickness in the air. It never lasts. It doesn't follow. I've learned to leave spaces alone, to let rooms keep what they're holding. Not every door needs to be open to know what waits behind it. Story number 3. I still remember the sound before anything else. Not a noise exactly, more like a pause where a noise should have been. The kind that makes you look up without knowing why. I'm writing this years later. From a different place, in a different life. Back then, I didn't think of memories as something that could wait for you. I thought they faded if you ignored them long enough. It was a rainy season, one of those long stretches where the sky never fully clears. I was living alone in a small coastal town in British Columbia, the kind of place that smells like wet wood and salt. The rain didn't fall hard. It just stayed. I had moved there after leaving a job I wasn't proud of. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet mistake that sat in my chest longer than it should have. I told people I wanted a reset. That wasn't the whole truth. I rented a narrow duplex near the water. The paint was peeling and the windows rattled when the wind came in from the bay. It was cheap, quiet, and far from anyone who knew me. At the time, it felt normal to live that way. Wake up, work freelance from a small desk, listen to the rain hit the siding. Evenings were long and empty, but I told myself I needed that. I had a habit I never talked about. When I was anxious, I replayed sounds in my head. Footsteps, voices, doors closing, anything familiar. The first week passed without incident. The rain soaked everything, including time. Days slid into each other. One evening, just before dusk, I noticed the pause again. The rain stopped for a breath, then continued. It made the room feel larger than it was. I was standing near the kitchen sink, watching water bead on the glass. The light outside was low and gray, with no real edge to it. That's when I felt the house settle. Not a creak, more like a shift in weight. I waited for a follow-up sound. Nothing came. At the time, I didn't think much of it. That night, I slept lightly. Not badly, just alert. Like part of me was listening, even while the rest tried to rest. The next morning, the rain returned heavier. Water pooled along the walkway outside my door. The town felt closed in, wrapped tight. I worked through the afternoon, music low, window cracked open. The smell of rain came in with the air. Everything felt muted. Around 4, I heard a sound from the other side of the wall. The duplex was split down the middle, but the other unit was empty. I had been told it was between tenants. The sound wasn't loud. It was a soft drag, like fabric against wood. It moved once, then stopped. I froze with my hands on the keyboard. I waited for it to repeat. It didn't. I told myself it was the building. Old places have voices if you listen long enough. That explanation usually worked for me. That evening, I cooked pasta and ate it standing up. The rain tapped the roof in uneven patterns. The other side of the wall stayed quiet. When night came, the air felt thicker. Not heavy, just full, like something had filled the gaps. I turned the lamp on early. The light pooled around the couch and didn't reach the corners well. I noticed that and didn't like it. Sometime after midnight, I heard the drag again. This time it was closer, not louder, just nearer. I sat up in bed and held still. The sound moved, paused, then faded. It felt deliberate, but I couldn't explain why. The next day, I checked the other unit from the outside. The door was locked. The windows were dark and empty. Rain ran down the glass in long lines. I saw my reflection there and looked away. That was another habit. That afternoon, I received an email from a former colleague. It was short and polite, asking how I was. I didn't respond. Guilt has its own weight. It settles where sound should be. I think that's why I noticed the quiet so much. By the third night, I stopped turning the lamp off. Sleep came in pieces. Every pause in the rain felt like a question. At some point before morning, I woke to the sound of breathing. Not close enough to panic. Not far enough to ignore. I held my breath and listened. The sound matched me. When I inhaled, it did too. I lay there until dawn pressed light through the curtains. When the room turned gray, the breathing stopped. The rain returned like nothing had happened. That morning, I found a wet mark along the baseboard in the living room. Not a leak, just damp, as if something had rested there. I knelt and touched it. The wood was cool, but not soaked. It dried too quickly. I laughed once, sharp and quiet. It sounded wrong in the room. I didn't do it again. I tried to change my routine. Walks during breaks, phone calls with people I trusted. The rain made everything feel shorter. One evening, I stood by the shared wall and pressed my palm against it. The surface felt solid. Normal. I left my hand there longer than needed. I felt a faint vibration, then nothing. I pulled back quickly. That night, I dreamed of standing in a hallway that never ended. Doors lined both sides, all closed. I woke before opening any of them. By the end of the week, I stopped working from home. I took my laptop to a cafe near the docks. The noise helped. Still, when I returned at night, the house felt expectant. Like it remembered me, even if I tried not to remember it. The rain never stopped long enough to reset anything. One evening, as I unlocked the door, I heard the drag clearly. It came from the other side of the wall, slow and careful. It stopped when I stepped inside. I stood in the entryway, keys still in my hand. The air felt tight around my shoulders. I didn't move. A thought came to me then, unwanted and soft, that the sound wasn't crossing the wall. It was using it. I didn't follow that thought. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, drank it too fast. My hands shook a little. Later, I noticed the rain had stopped again. The silence pressed close. I could hear my own pulse. From the living room, I heard the drag once more. This time it was inside. Not loud, just present. I stood in the doorway and watched the far corner. Nothing moved. The light didn't change. Still, the sense of someone else in the room stayed. Not watching, waiting. I thought about the mistake I had made before moving here. How I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken. How silence can feel safer than truth. The room felt closer then. The walls didn't move, but the space between them did. I took one step back. The drag shifted with me. Always the same distance. Never touching. I sat on the couch and kept my eyes forward. Minutes passed. The rain began again, soft and steady. When the sound finally faded, it didn't leave. It sank, like something settling into a place it had chosen. I slept on the couch that night with the lights on. Dreams stayed away, replaced by shallow rest. Morning came slowly. The next day, I called the landlord. I asked about the other unit. He said no one had been there for months. His voice sounded far away. I thanked him and hung up. The quiet returned. That afternoon, I found another dab mark. This one higher on the wall, at shoulder height. I didn't touch it. I stepped back and watched it fade. The wall looked normal again. By then, I understood something without words. The house wasn't loud because it didn't need to be. It had learned my habits. That night, the rain came down harder than it had all week. Water ran along the gutters in thick streams. The sound filled the rooms. I stood by the shared wall once more. The drag didn't come. The silence felt heavier for it. I rested my forehead against the cool paint and closed my eyes. I told myself I was just tired. That leaving would fix everything. Behind my eyelids, I felt a shift. Not in the house, in the space just behind me. I opened my eyes slowly and didn't turn around. The rain masked everything else. The room felt full again. I stood there, heart steady, breath shallow. Part of me wanted to move. Another part didn't want to break the moment. I stayed exactly where I was, listening to the rain and the quiet beneath it. Whatever was behind me didn't rush. It waited. I stayed where I was longer than made sense. The rain outside kept its slow rhythm, steady enough to lean on. Whatever filled the room behind me did not rush. I told myself not to turn around, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because seeing felt like an agreement. Some things only exist if you give them your full attention. My breath stayed shallow. I counted it once, then stopped myself. Counting it always made things worse. The space behind me felt close without touching, like standing near someone you don't want to acknowledge. The air held a shape I couldn't name. I took one small step forward. The feeling followed, keeping the same distance, not chasing, matching. That was when I understood it wasn't trying to scare me. Fear would have been loud. This felt practiced. I went to the kitchen and filled the kettle, letting the sound of water break the moment. The presence didn't disappear, but it loosened, thinning like steam. I stood there until the kettle clicked off on its own. That night I didn't sleep in the bedroom. I stayed on the couch with the lamp on low. The rain kept going like it had been instructed to. Sometime before morning, I woke with the sense that I wasn't alone. Not startled, just aware. The room felt fuller than it had a right to be. I didn't open my eyes right away. I listened for breathing. There was none. Instead, I felt a pressure near my sheet, light and steady, as if someone were standing close, careful not to be noticed. I let the moment pass without moving. When I finally opened my eyes, the room looked normal. Lamp still on, rain still falling. The pressure was gone, but the impression remained, like a handprint on fabric after someone steps away. I stayed awake until daylight softened the walls. The next few days followed a pattern. The rain came and went. The house stayed quiet in a way that felt intentional. The drag sound returned sometimes, never sudden, never loud, always at the edge of hearing. I stopped reacting to it. No freezing, no listening too hard. I treated it the way you treat a ticking clock you can't turn off. That seemed to change things. The sound grew less frequent. The damp marks stopped appearing, but the air stayed alert, like it was watching how I moved. One evening, the rain stopped completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. I stood by the window and waited for it to break. It didn't. That was the first time I felt truly uneasy. The rain had been a cover. Without it, everything else stood exposed. I sat at the small desk near the shared wall and worked until my eyes hurt. The other unit stayed quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, I felt the shift again. Not behind me this time. Above. I didn't look up. I knew better by then. The ceiling felt closer, like the space between us had shrunk. The light flickered once, then steadied. I held still and waited. A thought drifted through me, slow and unwelcome, that the presence wasn't confined to the wall anymore, that it had learned the rest of the house. I stood and walked to the front door, keys in my hand. Leaving crossed my mind and stayed there. So did another thought, quieter but heavier, that if I ran, it would follow, not physically, habitually. I unlocked the door and stepped outside anyway. The air was cold and clean, free of the house's weight. I breathed deeper than I had in days. The duplex looked harmless from the street, lights on, curtains drawn, nothing out of place. I stood there longer than needed, then went back inside. The air met me halfway, familiar and waiting. It felt almost relieved. That night I dreamed of water filling a room very slowly, not rising, just existing where it shouldn't. When I woke, I knew I had to change something. Not the house, my place in it. I stopped avoiding the shared wall. I stopped sleeping with the lights on. I stopped pretending the space was empty. Instead, I treated it like a roommate who didn't speak. I moved calmly. I didn't narrate my fear. When the drag sound came, I didn't follow it. When the air thickened, I didn't retreat. I stayed present without engaging. This went on for days, then weeks. The rain returned, softer this time. One evening, I noticed something subtle. The presence no longer matched my distance. It lagged. Not far, just enough to notice. I took a step forward. It stayed where it was. I took another. The room felt lighter, like a held breath, finally released. The drag didn't come. The air didn't press. That night, I slept in my bed for the first time in weeks. Dreams came back, scattered but harmless. Morning arrived without tension. I started packing a few days later. Not in a rush, just preparing. The landlord didn't ask questions when I gave notice. He sounded tired, like he'd had this conversation before. On my last night, the rain stopped again. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less expectant, more resigned. I stood by the shared wall one final time. I didn't touch it. I didn't listen. "I won't stay," I said quietly. The words weren't a threat. They were a fact. The air shifted once, subtle and slow. Not angry, not sad. When I left the next morning, the house felt smaller, like it had folded part of itself inward. I didn't look back. I live somewhere else now, another coastal town, more light, more space. Sometimes when rain pauses too suddenly, I feel that old awareness return. Not fear, recognition. I don't stop, I keep moving. Some places learn you if you let them. Others only remember you as long as you remember them. I've learned the difference. Story number 4, I remember the quiet first, not silence exactly. More like the sound of everything deciding to stay still at the same time. I'm thinking about it now because the weather has turned again. The kind of cold that presses flat against the windows and doesn't ask to come in. It brings things back. even when you don't invite them. Back then, I was working nights as an archive assistant at a small municipal building in northern Minnesota. Nothing dramatic. Old permits, handwritten logs, water records. Nobody had opened in decades. It was the kind of job you take when you don't want to be noticed. I had made a mistake earlier that year, not the kind you confess easily, the kind you try to outwait. Moving north felt like a pause button. Fewer people, shorter conversations, long winters that swallowed sound. The building sat 1 block off the town square. Brick, low and heavier than it looked. It held cold the way a stone does. At night, it belonged to me. The day staff left by 6, and the cleaners came through fast. By 8, the place was empty except for my desk lamp and the hum in the walls. Snow had already started falling by the time this happened. Not thick yet, just enough to blur edges. Everything outside looked softened, unfinished. My routine was simple. Unlock the side door, turn on the desk light, work through boxes until midnight, then lock up. I liked the predictability. It gave my thoughts something to lean against. At the time, it felt normal to want that. The first sign wasn't a sound. It was a delay. I had just finished labeling a file when I noticed my breath fogging longer than it should have. The heater was on. The room didn't feel colder, just slower. I stood up and stretched, listening. The building made its usual noises, pipes settling, a faint tick from the ceiling, but something felt off, like a room that hasn't decided what it is yet. I shrugged it away. Fatigue explains a lot. Later that night, I heard the elevator shaft shift. Not the elevator itself, just the space around it. The elevator hadn't worked in years. It was sealed, doors bolted shut, labeled for future repair that never came. Everyone used the stairs. The sound wasn't loud, more like a soft drag, slow and careful. It lasted a few seconds, then stopped. I waited for it to repeat. It didn't. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Old buildings carry echoes. You learn that quickly. The next few nights passed the same way. Snow thickened. The town grew quieter. On the 4th night, I noticed something different in the archives room. One of the boxes had shifted. Not much, just enough to catch my eye. I checked the label. Same handwriting, same placement. Nothing missing. I told myself I had bumped it earlier. That explanation felt thin, but I accepted it. I needed to. A bad habit of mine is filling gaps too fast. Silence makes me uncomfortable. Always has. That night when I locked up, I paused near the elevator doors. I don't know why. Something about the air there felt unfinished. I rested my hand against the metal. Cold, but steady. Nothing happened. Still, I stood there longer than necessary, listening for something I couldn't name. Then I left. The snow was falling heavier when I stepped outside. It swallowed my footprints almost immediately. That bothered me more than it should have. By the following week, the delay returned. Not just once. Often. Lights took longer to settle when I switched them on. Sounds arrived half a beat late, like the building was thinking before responding. I kept working. That's another habit. If you don't stop, things can't catch you. One night, close to 11, I heard a soft knock. Not on the door, inside the walls. 3 taps, spaced evenly, then nothing. I froze, counting without meaning to. I hated that about myself. Counting made it feel real. I waited. No follow-up sound came. The building stayed still. I laughed once under my breath. The sound fell flat in the room. I didn't do it again. After that, the archive room felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. The shelves seemed closer together. The air felt pressed, like it had weight. I started leaving the radio on low, just enough to break the quiet. That helped. For a while, the first time I smelled it, I thought it was the heater. Old dust. Cold metal. Something faintly damp. It came and went without pattern. Never strong. Just noticeable enough to register. I checked the vents. Nothing wrong. No leaks. At home, I slept poorly. Dreams felt shallow. like they didn't finish forming. I woke often without knowing why. One night during a storm, the power flickered. The radio cut out mid-sentence. The building held its breath. When the lights came back, I noticed the elevator doors were damp, not wet, condensed. I stared at them longer than I should have. The metal looked darker, almost bruised. I didn't touch it this time. I returned to my desk and kept working. Hands steady, thoughts less so. That's when I realized the sound wasn't random. It followed attention. When I focused on my work, the building stayed quiet. When my mind drifted, the delays returned. The knocks, the shifts, it felt practiced. That thought made my stomach tighten. I pushed it away. Near the end of November, the snow cut the town off for 2 days. No plows, no traffic, just white and quiet. I still went in. The building needed someone present, they said. I didn't argue. That night, the archive room felt fuller. Not crowded. Occupied. I could sense something behind me without hearing it, like standing back to back with someone in line, close but polite. I didn't turn around, not out of fear, out of instinct. The radio hissed softly. The heater clicked. My breath fogged again. I wrote labels slower, careful not to rush. Movement felt important. When I finally stood, the pressure eased. The space opened slightly, like it had been watching to see what I'd do. That was the night I understood something. The building wasn't reacting to noise. It was reacting to pause. Stillness gave it shape. Time gave it room. And I had given it both. I started keeping my hands busy, sorting, stacking, writing, never letting a moment sit too long. It worked for a while. But on the last night before December, something changed. The snow stopped mid-fall. The town went unnaturally quiet. Inside, the radio went silent without shutting off. No static, just absence. I stood at my desk, pen hovering over a label. The delay stretched. Everything waited. From behind me, not touching, not breathing, I felt it settle. Close enough to register warmth. Far enough to avoid contact. I stayed still. I didn't count. I didn't turn. The building felt heavier then, like it had chosen a shape. Not solid. Intentional. I stood there until my legs ached. Until the radio clicked back on by itself. Until the snow outside began to fall again. When the sound returned, the presence thinned. It didn't leave. It withdrew. I locked up early that night. The elevator doors were dry again. Nothing looked out of place. At home, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, thinking about my mistake, about the things you avoid by staying busy. Some spaces don't want attention. Others need it to exist. I wasn't sure which this was yet. The next shift was scheduled the same as always. Snow, quiet, long hours. I stood outside the building before unlocking the door, listening to nothing, feeling watched without being seen. I put the key into the lock and paused. Not afraid, just aware. I hadn't decided yet whether to go in, or what would happen if I didn't. I went in the next night, not because I had decided anything, because leaving the question unanswered felt heavier than staying. The snow had settled into a flat, endless white. No wind, no tracks. The town looked paused, like a photograph. Inside, the building felt different right away. Not fuller, more contained. I unlocked the door and waited a moment before stepping in. The air met me gently, without resistance. That almost felt worse. The radio came on when I flipped the switch. Low volume. A voice speaking slowly about nothing important. I sat at my desk and began where I had left off. Labels first. Simple, repetitive work. For a while, nothing happened. The heater hummed. The light stayed steady. I let myself relax just a little. Not enough to drift. Enough to breathe normally. That was when I noticed the delay had changed. It wasn't longer this time. It was shorter. Sounds arrived before I expected them. A page brushed against another before my fingers moved. The heater clicked just before it should have. The building felt eager. I didn't like that word, but it fit. Eager implies intention. I wasn't ready for that. I kept working anyway, hands busy, mind anchored. Around 10, the radio cut to silence again, not abruptly, as if someone had slowly turned the sound down. I waited for it to come back. It didn't. The room felt taller then. Ceilings always do when sound leaves. I became aware of my posture, my breathing. I stood up slowly. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor. That sound echoed longer than it should have. I didn't move again right away. I let the moment stretch. I wanted to see what it would do. Nothing happened. That absence felt deliberate, like waiting for permission. I didn't give it. I walked toward the elevator doors, not drawn, just curious enough to be careful. The metal looked the same as always, dull, unremarkable. I stopped a few feet away. The air between us felt warmer, not hot, just occupied. I thought about my mistake again. How I had stayed quiet when speaking might have changed things. How stillness can feel like safety until it isn't. I rested my hand against the wall instead of the doors. The paint was cool, solid. Behind me, something shifted. Not close enough to touch, close enough to register. I didn't turn. I focused on the radioless silence, on the faint hum of electricity in the walls, on the slow rhythm of my breath. The pressure behind me eased slightly, like it was adjusting. Learning. That thought stayed with me as I returned to my desk. Learning requires patience. So does avoidance. The rest of the shift passed without incident. No knocks, no smells, just a feeling of being observed without judgment. I locked up at midnight and stepped into the snow. The cold cleared my head. For a moment, I felt almost normal. Sleep came easier that night, not deep, but uninterrupted. Over the next week, I noticed a pattern. The building responded less when I filled time, more when I paused. Stillness gave it room. Movement took it away. Attention shaped it. I tested that idea carefully. Never all at once, just enough to observe. When I stood still too long, the air pressed closer. When I worked steadily, it receded. Not gone, just quieter. It felt less like a presence and more like a habit, a behavior reinforced over time, something that had learned to exist in gaps. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. On a night when the snow fell heavy again, I made a choice. Not a plan, just a shift. I turned the radio off on purpose. The silence spread immediately. Clean and sharp, I sat at my desk and did nothing. Hands folded, breathing even. The building responded at once. The air thickened. The delay stretched. Behind me, the space filled carefully. No rush, no pressure. I stayed still. Minutes passed. My legs began to ache. I didn't move. The presence settled closer than before, not touching, hovering at the edge of contact. I focused on the feeling without naming it. Naming gives things shape. I didn't want to help. The heater clicked off. The lights dimmed slightly, then steadied. The building felt attentive. I realized then that it wasn't trying to take anything. It was waiting to be noticed, sustained by attention, not fear. That didn't make it harmless. Dependence rarely is. I shifted my weight just enough to break the moment. The pressure eased immediately. The air loosened. I turned the radio back on. The voice returned mid-sentence. Ordinary and grounding. That was enough for that night. I didn't push further. Some boundaries worked best when implied. After that, I stopped experimenting. I didn't want to teach it more. I wanted to leave. I gave notice the following week. No explanation, just a date. The last night came quietly. No storm, no wind, just cold and still. I packed my desk, turning off the lamp for the final time. The building felt aware of the change. Not upset, just alert. I stood once more near the elevator doors, not to confront, to acknowledge. "I'm not staying," I said softly. The words felt balanced, neither challenge nor apology. The air shifted in response, a slow adjustment, then nothing. I locked the door and stepped into the snow. My footprints stayed this time. The town felt present again. I moved south after that. Another job, another routine, different walls. Most nights are quiet now. The good kind. The kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Sometimes, though, when I stop moving for too long, I feel it. Not the building, the habit. A sense that stillness can gather weight if you let it. That attention can give shape to things better left undefined. I don't linger on that thought. I keep my hands busy. I let sound exist. I move through rooms without pausing too long. Some places don't follow you. They wait, patient in their own way. And sometimes I wonder if the building learned enough to notice the next person, or if it only remembers me when I remember it. I haven't decided which feels better. Story number 5. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the building sounded when it stopped making noise. I was sitting at my desk with my jacket still on, hands resting flat on a stack of folders, waiting for the heater to kick back in. The snow outside had been falling since late afternoon, thick and steady, the kind that erased sound instead of adding to it. For a while, the place felt sealed off from the rest of the town, like a box set down gently and left alone. At the time, that quiet felt normal. I worked nights at the county records office, the one tucked behind the old courthouse near the river. It wasn't a scary job. It was slow, boring, and paid just enough to keep the lights on. Most nights I sat alone, sorting files that no one had asked for in years. The building itself was low and wide, built long before anyone thought about comfort. The floors were linoleum, faded to a dull green, and the walls had been repainted so many times they looked soft around the edges. There were no windows in the records room, just a narrow hallway that led to a locked side door and the stairs. I liked working nights because nothing was expected of me. No calls, no visitors, no small talk. The snow made it easier. When storms hit, the town stayed home. Even the police cruiser that usually rolled past once an hour didn't bother. That night, the storm was heavier than usual. I remember checking the time and feeling surprised that only 40 minutes had passed. My coffee was already cold. The heater had stopped cycling, leaving the room in a flat, dull temperature that wasn't warm or cold enough to complain about. I told myself to stand up and stretch, but I didn't. Something about the quiet felt thicker than normal, like it had weight. I flipped through another folder, the paper whispering softly as it moved. The sound felt louder than it should have. It lingered a little too long in the room, as if the walls were slow to let it go. I didn't think much of it. A lot of old buildings echo in strange ways. The first odd thing happened when I stood up. My chair rolled back farther than it should have, bumping lightly into the desk behind me. The sound was small, but it didn't fade. It sat there, hanging in the air, long enough for me to turn and look at the empty space. Nothing was there. I stepped into the aisle between the shelves, the floor cool under my shoes. The rows of file cabinets stretched out evenly, neat and quiet, the labels worn smooth by time. I'd walked those aisles hundreds of times. That night they felt longer. I reached the end and paused, listening. The building wasn't making its usual sounds. No ticking pipes, no soft hum from the lights. Even the distant wind seemed muted. It felt like standing under fresh snow, the way everything goes still before sound comes back. I told myself it was just the storm. When I returned to my desk, the heater clicked on again, a soft, reassuring sound. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and sat down. That should have been the end of it. Around 10, I heard something move near the stairs. Not footsteps, more like a shift. The kind of sound you hear when someone adjusts their weight without meaning to be noticed. I looked up from my paperwork, pen hovering over the page. The hallway light was still on, casting the same pale yellow glow. The door at the end remained closed. I waited. Nothing followed. I told myself it was the building settling, the way it always did when temperatures dropped fast. I'd heard similar noises before, usually earlier in the night. Still, I found myself listening harder than usual. I turned the radio on low, letting a talk station fill the room with soft voices that didn't matter. The sound helped. It gave the space shape again, edges I could feel. For a while, everything stayed normal. The snow outside piled higher, pressing against the walls. Every so often I imagined I could feel it leaning in, the way drifts do when they stack too long against a fence. At 11, the radio cut out. Not abruptly. It faded, like someone slowly turning a dial. I reached over and tapped it, expecting static. Nothing happened. The display stayed lit, the volume knob untouched. The silence returned, heavier than before. That was when I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to make me wonder if it was real. Something dry and old, like cardboard left in a damp basement too long. It reminded me of the boxes we used to store holiday decorations in when I was a kid. I stood up again, slower this time. The smell seemed stronger near the shelves, but that didn't make sense. The files were clean, sealed, untouched for years. I checked the trash bin under my desk, then the corner near the stairs. Nothing. The smell faded as I moved, never settling anywhere long enough to pin down. I sat back down, annoyed with myself for letting the quiet get under my skin. That was when the delay started. I didn't notice it right away. It was subtle, almost polite. I would move my hand, and the sound would follow just a fraction of a second later. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel wrong. Paper brushed paper after my fingers had already passed. My pen clicked just after I set it down. I tested it without meaning to, tapping the desk once. The sound came back late. My stomach tightened, not in panic, but in that slow, creeping way you feel when something doesn't match itself anymore. I stood and clapped my hands once. The sound answered me, delayed and dull. I didn't clap again. Instead, I walked toward the hallway, keeping my steps even. The delay followed me. My shoes struck the floor, and the sound lagged behind like an echo that couldn't quite keep up. At the stairs, I stopped. The delay stopped, too. Everything went quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like listening through snow. I rested my hand on the wall, grounding myself in the cold paint. I thought about leaving early. I thought about how silly that would sound if I tried to explain it later. So I went back to my desk. The delay didn't return right away. The radio stayed silent, the smell gone. For a few minutes, everything lined up again, movements and sounds matching the way they should. I relaxed enough to sit down. That was my mistake. The pressure didn't announce itself. It just arrived, slowly, the way deep water presses in when you step too far out. The air around my shoulders felt heavier, like someone had draped a thick blanket over the room. I didn't feel watched. I felt accommodated, as if the space was adjusting itself around me. I stayed still, afraid that moving might make it worse. My breath sounded loud in my ears, but the room didn't echo it. The silence swallowed the sound before it could travel. I told myself not to think too hard about it. Thinking gives things shape. I reached for my coffee, then stopped halfway. The smell was back, stronger now, mixed with something colder. I set the mug down without drinking. Behind me, something shifted again. Closer this time. Not close enough to touch, close enough to register. I didn't turn. The pressure eased slightly when I stayed still, like the room approving of my choice. That thought unsettled me more than the presence itself. I turned the radio back on. The sound returned instantly, louder than before. Voices filled the room, talking over each other, unimportant and grounding. The pressure pulled back, thinning out until the air felt normal again. I stayed like that for the rest of the shift. Radio on, movement slow, no pauses. When midnight finally came, I packed up without lingering. The hallway felt normal again, the stairs quiet and solid under my feet. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the snow. The cold hit hard, sharp, and clean. It felt good, real. I slept poorly that day, waking often without knowing why. Still, when I returned the next night, I told myself it had been exhaustion, nothing more. Snow does strange things to sound. The second night, the building remembered me faster. The delays started sooner. The silence felt ready, like it had been waiting. I didn't test it this time. I kept the radio on, kept my hands moving. Still, the pressure came back, gentle and patient. It didn't push, it waited. I realized then that whatever it was, it responded to stillness more than fear. When I paused, it leaned in, When I filled the space with motion and sound, it stayed back. That realization sat heavy in my chest. I finished my shift without incident, but I knew something had changed. The building no longer felt empty when I left. It felt occupied in a way I couldn't explain. On the third night, the snow sealed the doors before I even arrived. Drifts climbed the sides of the building, pressing against the walls. The world outside felt gone, erased by white. Inside, the quiet wrapped tighter than ever. I stood at my desk, coat still on, radio silent in my hand. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. Instead, I stood there and listened. The building held its breath. So did I. I stayed awake the rest of that night without meaning to. Not alert, not afraid, just unable to let myself settle. When morning came, it felt thin and unfinished, like the night hadn't fully let go. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world pale and flat. I went home with the sense that I was bringing something unfinished with me, though nothing followed through the door. Sleep during the day felt shallow. I drifted in and out, waking each time my apartment went too quiet. Every pause and sound felt heavier than it should have. I left the radio on low, the way some people leave a light burning. That evening, I considered calling in sick. The thought came and went without drama. I told myself it would look strange after years of never missing a shift. So I went back. The snow had crusted over by then, hardening into something that reflected sound instead of swallowing it. My boots were loud against it, the noise following me farther than usual. The building stood exactly where it always had, low and patient. Inside, the air greeted me without resistance. That detail stayed with me. I hung my coat and turned the radio on before sitting down. The sound filled the room quickly, like it had been waiting. I took that as a good sign, even though I didn't know why. For the first hour, nothing felt wrong. The files stayed files. The lights stayed steady. I let my shoulders drop a little. Then I noticed the radio wasn't changing anymore. Songs ended, voices paused, but the tone of the room stayed exactly the same. No shifts, no dips. It felt as if the sound existed without moving forward. I checked the dial, then the clock. Time was passing. Sound wasn't. I turned the radio off. The silence rushed in faster than before. It didn't settle. It pressed. The air felt closer to my skin, as if the space between me and the walls had shrunk. I stood up slowly, careful not to create gaps. My movements felt louder inside my head than in the room. The delay returned, subtle and patient, like a familiar habit. I remembered what I had noticed the night before. Stillness invited it. Motion discouraged it, so I kept moving. I reorganized drawers that didn't need it. I wiped a clean desk with a cloth that picked up nothing. I walked the aisles without stopping at the ends. The pressure stayed back while I did. When I paused to catch my breath, it edged closer. Not all at once, just enough to be noticed. I started humming without thinking. The sound thin but continuous. The pressure receded again. That was when I understood it wasn't interested in me as a person. It responded to conditions, like moisture, like heat, like quiet. The thought made my chest feel tight in a way fear hadn't. Conditions can be recreated. Habits can spread. I finished my shift without letting myself stop again. The moment I locked the door behind me, the feeling lifted, as if it respected boundaries set by distance. The next night, I brought my own noise. A small fan, a second radio, a habit of tapping my fingers lightly against the desk. The building reacted differently to that. The pressure still came, but it didn't know where to settle. It hovered, unsure, thinning at the edges. I kept everything slightly uneven. Sounds overlapped. Movements stayed imperfect. The silence never got a chance to collect. That night passed without incident. So did the one after. By the fourth night, I almost believed I had solved it. Not fixed it, just learned how to keep it at bay. That was when the building changed its approach. The silence didn't come all at once anymore. It arrived in sections. Corners would quiet first, then the ceiling, then the space behind me. I could keep noise going and still feel it gather elsewhere. It learned to exist alongside sound. That realization made my hands shake. I slowed my movements, not to invite it, but because rushing felt wrong. The pressure stayed spread out, thin but present, like fog that doesn't thicken no matter how long you stand in it. Near midnight, I made a mistake. I stopped moving to listen. The pressure focused immediately. It didn't rush. It condensed, drawing itself together behind me. The air felt warmer there, occupied in a way I could sense without turning around. I didn't look. I spoke instead, quietly, without planning to. "I'm here," I said. The pressure eased. That scared me more than anything else so far. It meant acknowledgement mattered. Attention mattered. I didn't speak again. After that night, the building felt alert. Even when nothing happened, I could sense it noticing when I arrived, the way a room notices someone who has paced it too many times. I stopped experimenting. I didn't want to teach it more than I already had. A week later, I gave notice. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The supervisor nodded in a way that suggested she understood more than she said. My last shift came quietly. No snow, no wind, just cold and still. I packed my things slowly, letting myself move naturally for the first time in days. The pressure was there, familiar now, but restrained. It felt aware of the ending, though I couldn't explain why. I stood once more near the center of the room and let everything go quiet. Not long, just enough. The air thickened, careful and curious. It didn't crowd me, it waited. I felt the shape of its attention without details, like standing near someone in the dark. "I'm not staying," I said, keeping my voice neutral. The pressure shifted, then loosened. Not disappointed, not angry. Simply adjusting to a new condition. I turned the lights off and left. The days that followed felt lighter. Not relieved, just less watched. I slept better than I had in weeks. Still, some habits stayed with me. I don't let rooms go fully quiet anymore. I keep a sound going, even if it's just air moving through vents. I avoid standing still too long in enclosed spaces. Sometimes when snow falls heavy and the world goes quiet, I feel it again. Not the building, the pattern. The sense that stillness can accumulate, that attention gives weight. I don't think it followed me. I don't think it needed to. Conditions exist everywhere if you let them. I've learned to interrupt them. Story number 6. The rain had already been falling for hours when my shift started. It was the soft kind of rain that doesn't splash or rush, just a steady sound, like someone breathing slowly outside the walls. I worked nights at a small public archive near the coast. It wasn't a big place, just a low building with old records and maps that hardly anyone asked for anymore. Most nights felt the same. Quiet, slow, easy to drift through. That night felt different before anything actually happened. I remember standing by the front desk, shaking water off my jacket, listening to the rain press against the windows. The street outside was empty, washed clean and shining under the lamps. At the time, it felt normal to feel a little alone there. Night work does that to you. The archive used to be a school decades ago. You could still feel that in the hallways, the way sound carried and then disappeared. I liked that part. It made the building feel lived in, even when it wasn't. I turned on the desk lamp and signed my name in the logbook. The clock said 9:58 p.m. 2 minutes early, like always. I didn't rush to sit down. I stood there a moment longer than usual, listening. The rain sounded louder inside than it should have. Not sharper, just closer. I told myself it was the roof. Old buildings do strange things with weather. My job was simple. Check requests, scan old papers, put everything back where it belonged. Most nights, no one came in at all. That was part of why I took the job. I liked work that didn't ask questions. Around 10:30, I noticed the lights in the back room flicker. Not off, just a soft dip, like someone blinked. I looked up from the scanner and waited. The light stayed steady after that. I didn't think much of it. About 15 minutes later, the scanner made a sound I hadn't heard before. Not an alarm, just a low click, like it had finished something early. The screen was blank. I tapped it once and it came back on. The file I had been working on was still there. That should have been enough to let it go. But I felt a small knot form under my ribs. It wasn't fear, more like attention. I kept working. The rain outside picked up a little, tapping harder against the glass. I found myself matching my breathing to it without meaning to. In, out. The first real sign came just after 11. I was walking down the main hallway with a box of folders when I heard a chair move. Not scrape, just shift. I stopped where I was. The sound had come from the reading room, the one with the long tables and old lamps. I knew for a fact no one was there. I stood still, holding the box, listening for something else. Nothing followed. At the time, it felt normal to assume the building was settling. Rain can do that too. I finished putting the folders away and went back to the desk. I sat down slower than usual. I noticed then that the room felt smaller, not tighter, just closer. Like the walls had leaned in a little while I wasn't looking. I turned the radio on low, a talk station, voices going on about things that didn't matter. The sound helped. It gave the room shape again. For a while, everything stayed calm. I scanned, labeled, filed. The rain stayed steady. At midnight, I stood up to stretch. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint. Something like wet paper and dust. It reminded me of classrooms after a storm. Back when I was a kid. Not unpleasant, just old. I walked toward the back room to see if something had leaked. The floor was dry. The smell didn't follow me. It stayed where it was, near the center of the building. I stood there a moment, unsure what to do with that. Then I shrugged and went back to work. The second sign was the silence. The radio didn't turn off. It just stopped making sound. The display stayed lit. The voices froze mid-word. I reached over and turned the knob. Nothing changed. That was when I noticed how quiet the rain had become. It was still falling. I could see it, but the sound was gone. The quiet felt thick, like it had weight. I felt it press against my ears. I sat very still. In that stillness, I became aware of my own breathing. Then of something else. A pause, not a gap. A held moment. It felt like the building was waiting. I didn't like that thought. I pushed it away. I stood up, and the sound came back all at once. Rain, radio, the soft hum of the lights. Relief came so fast it surprised me. I laughed under my breath and shook my head. Night work was getting to me, that's all. I kept the radio a little louder after that. Around 1, I heard footsteps. Not walking, just a single step. It came from the hallway near the storage room, a place with no reason for anyone to be. I waited. No second step followed. I walked halfway down the hall and stopped. The lights were all on. The doors were closed the way I had left them. Everything looked normal. I told myself again that buildings make noise. I told myself again that I was tired. Still, I didn't turn the radio down. By 2, the rain had slowed. The quiet outside felt wider now. I noticed that when I stopped moving, the air felt heavier, not colder, just present. When I shuffled papers or tapped my pen, it eased. That pattern bothered me more than anything else so far. I started to move on purpose. Nothing big, just small sounds, a chair shift, a cough. The feeling stayed back when I did. That was when guilt crept in. Not guilt about the building, about myself. I had a habit of staying still too long, of letting silence settle. It had been that way since before this job, since before a lot of things. At the time, it felt normal to connect those thoughts. Now, I'm not so sure. Around 3, the lights flickered again. This time they stayed dim for a full second. I held my breath without meaning to. When they returned, the smell was stronger. Wet paper, dust. Something else underneath. I didn't try to name it. I noticed then, how slow my hands felt. Not weak, delayed. I would move and the sound would follow a heartbeat later. Paper brushed paper after my fingers passed. My shoes touched the floor before the step sounded. That delay made my chest tighten. I tested it once, tapping the desk. The sound answered late. I didn't do it again. I stood and paced the room slowly. The delay faded as long as I kept moving. When I stopped, it crept back. I realized then that the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of something that noticed gaps. That thought settled deep. I kept the radio on until dawn. When morning came, the rain had stopped completely. The world outside looked clean and pale. I locked up and stepped out into the fresh air. It felt thin, like waking from a long dream. I slept badly that day. Every pause woke me. The next night, I almost didn't go back. Not because I was scared, because part of me felt watched in a way that didn't end at the door. But I went anyway. The rain had started again by the time I arrived. Softer than before. Inside, the building felt ready. That's the only word I can think of now. I turned on the lights, the radio. I didn't wait for silence this time. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I almost relaxed. Then I stopped to drink some water. Just a pause, a small one. The air shifted immediately. Not rushing. Not loud. Just closer. I felt it at my shoulders, like someone standing behind me without touching. I didn't turn around. I took another sip, keeping my hand moving. The pressure eased. I understood something then that I wish I hadn't. The building wasn't reacting to fear. It was reacting to stillness, to attention. That realization followed me through the rest of the night. I didn't test it further. I didn't need to. By the time dawn came, I already knew something had changed. The archive no longer felt empty when I left. It felt occupied in a way I couldn't explain. Standing outside in the rain, I looked back at the windows. They reflected only the street. But I felt certain of one thing. If I stopped paying attention inside that building, something else would take its place. I didn't know yet what that meant for me. I only knew I wasn't done with that place. I stayed by the window longer than I meant to. The house across the street did not change. The door stayed open, and the inside stayed dark in a way that did not match the night. I kept thinking I would see the man again, or the girl, or some small movement that would explain everything. Nothing came. At the time, it felt normal to wait for a sign like that. I did not go to bed right away. I sat on the couch with my shoes still on, listening to the rain tap the windows. The sound was steady and soft, almost gentle. It made the house feel smaller, like everything had pulled in close to stay warm. I kept my eyes on the front door even though it was locked. When I finally did lie down, I left the hallway light on. The bedroom felt too quiet without it. I lay on my side and stared at the wall, trying to slow my breathing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blue toothbrush again, wet and dull in my hand. I could still feel the thin paper between my fingers. I did not sleep much that night. I drifted in and out, never fully gone. In one of those half dreams, I heard knocking again, not loud, not urgent, just steady. When I opened my eyes, the house was silent. My heart took a long time to settle. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The street looked clean, almost new, like it had been washed overnight. I stepped outside to get the mail and caught myself looking across the street without meaning to. The door on the empty house was closed now. The windows were dark and still. It looked like it always had. I told myself that was good. It meant things were over. It meant the moment had passed. Still, I did not throw the map away. I folded it again and put it in a small box with old keys and loose screws in the kitchen drawer. It felt safer there, hidden under ordinary things. I washed my hands longer than usual after touching it. The days after that were quiet in a way that felt forced. Neighbors waved, cars came and went. The trash truck arrived on Tuesday morning, loud and normal. I watched it from the window until it turned the corner. I did not put my own trash out until the last possible minute. I started noticing how much of my life ended up in the bin. Old receipts, empty bottles, broken things I did not want to fix. It all felt too easy to give away. I began tearing labels off and breaking boxes down smaller than needed. I could not explain why. It was just a habit that settled in. At work, I found it hard to focus. Simple tasks took longer. I kept replaying the knock in my head, trying to remember the exact rhythm. It bothered me that I could not. It was like trying to remember a tune with one note missing. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside. It was not knocking. It was softer than that. A scrape, maybe. I lay still and listened. The sound did not come again. When morning came, I checked the porch. There was nothing there. No marks. No sign anyone had been close. I started leaving the porch light off after that. I told myself it was to save power. Really, I did not want to see what might be standing there. Darkness felt safer than knowing. A week passed, then another. Life moved on in small ways. I went to the store. I answered emails. I laughed at a joke a coworker told. Sometimes, I even forgot about the toothbrushes for a few hours at a time. Then I found the bottle cap. It was red, sitting near the edge of the lawn. I did not remember buying anything with a cap like that. It was clean, as if it had just been set down. I left it where it was and went inside. When I looked again later, it was gone. After that, I began to notice how often I looked at the ground when I walked. I checked corners. I avoided the space near the curb where trash bins lined up on collection day. None of it felt like panic, it felt like learning. One evening I saw the girl again, or at least I thought I did. I was washing dishes when I noticed movement across the street, a small shape near the driveway of the empty house. I dried my hands and stepped closer to the window. There was nothing there when I looked directly. Still, the feeling stayed with me, the sense of being watched, not from one place, but from many. That night I dreamed of hands sorting through piles of things. Not fast, not careful, just patient. In the dream, I wanted to tell them they could keep whatever they found. I woke up before I could speak. I stopped using my back door after that. There was no reason, really. It just felt like the wrong exit. I entered and left through the front, locking it each time. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place became something I relied on. One afternoon, I came home to find a small plastic bag on my kitchen counter. My heart jumped before I realized it was one I had left there myself, holding screws from a loose hinge. Still, my hand shook as I moved it aside. It took a while before I could laugh at myself. I thought about calling the police more than once. Each time I imagined the conversation and felt foolish before it even started. There was nothing to report, nothing solid, just a feeling that did not fit into words. The empty house across the street sold at the end of the month. A moving truck arrived early one morning. I watched from behind the curtain as people carried boxes inside. They looked tired but happy, like people starting something new. I wanted to warn them, but I did not know how. That first night after they moved in, I heard music, soft and distant. It drifted across the street and through my open window. It sounded warm, human. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day, I found a blue bottle cap near my mailbox. I did not touch it. I stepped around it and went back inside. From the window, I watched the new neighbors come and go. They smiled, they waved, everything looked fine. Over time, the cap stopped appearing. The small, strange moments faded. I began to relax again. The box in the drawer stayed where it was, unopened. Some nights I even turned the hallway light off. Months passed. Winter came and went. Spring arrived quietly. The world felt normal again, or close enough that I stopped questioning it. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed a little girl standing on the sidewalk, 2 houses down. She was holding an adult's hand. I could not see their faces clearly in the dim light. I stood very still until they turned the corner. I did not sleep much that night. Now, when I think back on that morning with the knock, it feels far away, like something that happened to another version of me. Still, I keep my routines tight. I take my trash out at the same time every week. I do not leave things behind. I do not answer the door unless I'm expecting someone. Sometimes when the rain comes down just right, I think I hear counting again. I tell myself it is only water, only pipes, only the house settling. At the time, it feels normal to believe that. Tonight, I am standing by the front door with my hand on the lock. The porch light is off, the street is quiet. Across the way, the house looks dark, like it is holding its breath. I am not sure if I am waiting to hear something, or if I already have. Story number 7. I was 15 when the sounds first showed up, and at the start, they didn't feel important enough to name. They slipped into the house quietly, the way drafts do. The kind you only notice after you've been sitting still for a long time. Every second weekend, I packed a small bag and rode with my mom to my dad's place, a tired-looking house tucked into a quiet stretch of Vermont where trees leaned close to the road and the nights felt longer than they should have. My parents had been apart for as long as I could remember, so the routine was fixed. Mom's apartment during the week, Dad's house on weekends. At the time, it felt normal, like something you stop questioning because it never changes. Dad's house always smelled faintly of dust and cold wood, even in summer, and the floors made soft noises when you walked, like they were talking to themselves. The house had belonged to my grandmother, Maria, before everything shifted. She hadn't lived there for years before she died. She moved out to care for her husband in another place, leaving my dad behind in the old house like a bookmark stuck in a chapter no one wanted to reread. By the time I started spending weekends there, the place felt tired. Paint peeled in thin curls, the porch leaned a little, windows rattled even when the wind was calm. Looking back, I think the house was already heavy before the sounds began. It felt like it was holding on to things no one had finished saying. Inside, the layout was simple, but it never felt easy. My grandmother's bedroom sat on the first floor, right off the kitchen. The other rooms were upstairs, along with a narrow space filled with boxes no one ever opened. Dad had one rule. He repeated every visit, always in the same flat tone. I wasn't allowed to go into Maria's room. Not to clean it, not to look, not even to stand in the doorway. After she died, the room turned into a place where unwanted things went to wait. Broken chairs, old papers, bags filled with clothes that still smelled like her soap. Even so, her bed stayed there pressed against the wall, and her vanity mirror stood in the corner, dull with dust. No one touched those. They felt anchored. Another thing about the house never quite made sense to me. In the kitchen, right behind the trash can, there had once been a hole in the wall. Not a crack, a real opening, dark inside, like the house had been started and never finished. Dad covered it with a thin board after a while, screwing it in place and acting like it had never been there. Still, whenever I stood at the sink, I felt like the wall behind me was listening. A few months after Maria died, the sounds began to find their way out. At first, they were easy to ignore, a dull thud here and there, always late at night. I told myself it was pipes or wood shifting as the temperature dropped. Old houses do that. Everyone knows that. Still, these sounds didn't slide or creak. They landed, one after another, slow, steady. It wasn't scratching. It wasn't chewing. It sounded like a hand pressing into the wall from the inside, testing it. I told my dad one morning while he stood at the counter, staring into his coffee like it might answer him back. He listened without looking at me and nodded once, the way adults do when they want to move past something. He checked for pests later that day. No droppings, no nests, nothing disturbed. The house stayed still while he looked. The next weekend I was gone to my mom's place. He set up a small camera in the kitchen. When I came back, we sat together and watched the footage. Hours of empty space, no shadows crossing the floor, no movement near the wall. The board stayed in place the whole time. Dad sighed and told me I had too much imagination. I didn't argue. I just nodded and kept quiet. I knew what I had heard. There's a difference between a house settling and something keeping time. Around then, the rest of the house started to feel tighter. My dad stopped leaving unless he had to. Arguments with his brothers and sisters spilled into phone calls that ended with slammed doors. They were fighting over the house, over whether it should be sold or kept. The place was falling apart, they said. Dad wouldn't budge. He stayed planted inside it, letting the grass grow tall and the mail pile up. The air felt heavier every visit, like breathing through fabric. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. I stayed awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, listening. That was when the sounds were clearest. The thumping from the kitchen wall would start, slow and patient. Then, after a pause, I'd hear the same rhythm from the other side of the hallway, behind the door to Maria's room. They answered each other. One night, the house felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones instead of sitting on your skin. I lay awake until the numbers on my phone said it was close to 3. The thumping came again, steady as breathing. I didn't think much of it at first. Then it stopped. The silence felt louder than the sound had been. I don't remember deciding to get out of bed. I just did. I moved slowly, avoiding the spots on the stairs that complained when you stepped on them. The hallway smelled stale, like old paper and dust. I stood outside Maria's room with my hand on the door, listening. Nothing moved. I pushed the door open just enough to see inside. The room smelled like mothballs and damp earth, a smell that didn't belong upstairs. Moonlight slid through the window and rested on the bed. The thick knitted blanket lay smooth on the mattress, heavy and still. I stood there longer than I should have. Then the blanket lifted. It wasn't sudden. It rose slowly, as if pulled up by a breath that had been waiting a long time to be taken. The shape underneath pressed against the fabric and then sank back down. The blanket settled, moving just enough to make the bed creak softly. It looked like someone trying to sit up and failing. I didn't stay to understand it. I turned and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on the floor with my back against the tub and waited for the light to change. My teeth wouldn't stop chattering, even after the sun started to come up. I told myself it had to be the air. Fabric moves. Old houses breathe. But there were no open windows in that room. After that night, the sounds followed me everywhere in the house. Thumps in the kitchen, soft knocks under the stairs. Sometimes, late at night, I heard something brushing against the taped basement door hidden beneath the staircase. It sounded like fingertips testing the edge, feeling for weakness. I started having dreams that didn't feel like dreams. In one, Maria sat on the edge of her bed wearing a thin hospital gown. She didn't look angry or sad. She just looked tired. She said my father's name once, quietly, like a reminder. When I woke up, the house felt closer than it had before. I stopped going to my dad's place not long after I turned 16. My mom noticed how my hands shook every time she dropped me off. Eventually, the court said I didn't have to go back if I didn't feel safe. I moved on with my life, or at least I tried to. Still, the house stayed with me. I woke up at 3 in the morning in my mom's apartment, listening for sounds that weren't there. At the time, it felt normal to think it was stress, but some nights, I could swear I heard the same slow rhythm, faint but familiar, like it was counting something out. A few months ago, my phone buzzed while I was sitting in my room. It was a message from my cousin. He said no one had seen my dad leave the house in weeks. The mail was piled up. The lawn looked like it had been forgotten. When the police arrived, they had to force the door. That was all he said at first. I sat there for a long time after reading it, thinking about the board over the hole in the kitchen wall, about the way the sounds always seemed to wait until the house was quiet enough to listen. I still don't know what conversation my dad thought he needed to finish. I didn't go back to Vermont when they took my dad away. I told myself there was nothing left for me there. No reason to stand in front of a place that had already taken enough from us. But the house didn't stay in Vermont. It followed me in smaller, quieter ways. For weeks after my cousin called, I couldn't sleep past 2 in the morning. I would wake up with my heart already racing like it had been running before I opened my eyes. My apartment was warm and clean, but the silence felt wrong. It was the same kind of silence that used to sit in my dad's kitchen right before the thumping started. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, that people don't shake off childhood fear easily. At the time, that explanation felt reasonable enough to accept. But my body didn't believe it. I started hearing sounds again, but not where I expected them. Not in the walls, not under the floor. They came from inside the pipes, deep in the building, like something shifting its weight slowly. It wasn't loud. It was steady, a soft pressure, then release, like breathing that wasn't meant to be heard. I stopped using the kitchen at night. I kept my meals simple and quiet, eating on the couch with the TV on low. Noise helped. It filled the space where my thoughts usually wandered. One evening, I noticed a dark line along the baseboard near the trash can. It looked like a shadow that hadn't been there before. I wiped it with a paper towel and it came away damp. The smell reminded me of wet soil. That night I dreamed about my grandmother again, not the hospital version, Not the warning version. She was younger, standing in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up, hands red from washing dishes. She didn't look at me. She just kept scrubbing the same plate over and over. When I tried to speak, my voice didn't come out. I woke up with my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I called my mom the next day and asked about the basement. She paused longer than usual before answering. She told me she hated that space, even before Maria got sick. She said the air down there always felt wrong, like it pressed back when you moved. I asked her why it had been taped shut. She said my dad did that after one of their fights. He told her some doors didn't need to be opened again. A week later, I received a message from my cousin Leo. The developer had found something else while clearing the lot. Not bones, not anything dramatic. They found the outline of a room that wasn't on the plans. A narrow space under where the kitchen had been, reinforced with extra beams. It was empty, but the walls were dark, like they had been touched too many times. Leo said the workers refused to finish that day. They packed up early and didn't come back until the sun was high. Nobody could explain why. After that, the sounds in my apartment became more specific. They moved, from the pipes to the wall behind my bed, from the wall to the corner near the closet. I started sleeping with a lamp on. Not because I was scared of the dark, because light made it harder to imagine things moving when I wasn't looking. One night I woke up with the feeling that someone was standing too close. Not watching, just there, like a presence that didn't need eyes. I stayed still and listened. There was a faint tapping sound, slow and careful. It reminded me of fingernails on wood, testing for weakness. I didn't move until morning. The tapping didn't come every night. That was worse. It made it impossible to prepare for. Some nights were quiet enough that I almost felt silly for worrying. Then I would find something moved. A chair pulled slightly away from the table, a cabinet left open, small changes that felt intentional. I started throwing my trash away outside immediately. I didn't let it sit. I washed my hands longer than necessary. I stopped keeping things I didn't use. It felt like preparing for something I couldn't name, like making space. I visited my dad once at the care facility. He didn't recognize me at first. He was staring at the wall behind his bed, lips moving without sound. When he finally looked at me, his eyes filled with relief. He told me she was quieter now, that she didn't need to knock as hard. I asked him who he meant. He smiled in a tired way and said the house knew he was listening. He said it was easier when you stopped pretending you didn't hear it. As I was leaving, I noticed marks on the wall near his bed. Small smudges, almost like fingerprints. They were at the height of someone sitting. I didn't go back after that. I couldn't tell if visiting made things better or worse. Some questions don't have answers that help. The dreams came back after that visit. Always the same kitchen, always the same smell. In the dreams, the hole in the wall was open, not dark, just empty, waiting. I would lean closer, feeling a pull in my chest, like something was reminding me of a promise I didn't remember making. I always woke up before I could hear my name. Last winter, my building flooded. A pipe burst in the middle of the night. Water poured through the walls, soaking the floors. When the maintenance crew opened the wall behind my bed, they found nothing unusual. No mold, no damage. But the inside of the drywall was stained. Not from water, from something darker, spread unevenly, like it had been touched again and again. The crew patched it quickly and didn't ask questions. Neither did I. Some repairs aren't meant to be understood. Since then, the sounds have faded. Not gone. Just farther away. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear movement beneath the floor. Not footsteps. Shifting. Like someone's settling in. I don't live in Vermont anymore. The house is gone. The land is empty. But I've learned that spaces don't always disappear when buildings do. Some rooms don't need walls to exist. They stay where attention once lingered too long. I still wake up around 3. I still listen before I move. And sometimes, when the apartment is quiet enough, I swear I can hear a slow, familiar rhythm. Not knocking, not asking, just waiting.